Stuka Joe here. Today we'll be taking a look at this game, New Cold War. We will go through the game's components, victory conditions, and an extended example of play. So, let's get this thing rolling. New Cold War is a game designed by Andoni Orive and Igor Plaza and published by Vuca Simulations. This is a 4-player card-driven game about global dominance that covers 30 years of recent history, starting in 1989 with the collapse of the Soviet Union until 2019 with the onset of the worldwide COVID-19 pandemic. In this game, each player takes control of one of 4 great powers: Russia, China, the European Union, or the United States. And the powers are arranged into 2 blocks: the Eastern Bloc, comprised of Russia and China, and the Western Bloc, with the European Union and the United States. And there will be a certain degree of cooperation between the bloc members, but powers will be focused on gaining international prestige by dominating the media and obtaining control of countries and regions of the world. In the end, only one player can win, so as you will see, cooperation in this game only goes so far. The game includes one 34 by 22-inch mounted map board, 167 poker-sized cards, 225 wooden discs, a sheet of counters and tiles. The game also includes 4 heavy cardstock player displays and one 48-page fully illustrated color rulebook. The rules for the 4-player game cover 24 pages, but there are rules to play the game with less than 4 players and even solitaire. The rulebook also includes a 4-player tutorial. The map board shows the world divided into 7 color-coded regions. Each region consists of a number of countries, and there are 86 countries represented in this game. And countries, as well as regions and sub-regions, form the basis of much of the victory points that are awarded in this game. There are 3 types of countries: regional powers, which are geostrategic countries that exercise leadership in their respective regions. Each regional power is worth 3 victory points to the player that controls it, and there are only 5 regional powers in the game: Mexico in the region of Central America, Brazil in South America, South Africa in Africa, and India and Japan, both in the region of Asia. There's also geostrategic countries, and these are countries that are key to controlling a certain region. Control of a geostrategic country gives the player 2 victory points, and there are 18 geostrategic countries in the game. Here we see the 4 located in Africa: Algeria, Libya, Nigeria, and Congo. And here we see Venezuela and Argentina in South America. And finally, the remaining 63 countries are non-geostrategic countries, each worth 1 victory point to the player that controls them. Here we see the countries that comprise the region of Southeast Asia. All countries shown here are non-geostrategic countries, with the exception of Indonesia, which is a geostrategic country. Stability is the number or pair of numbers shown on the map for each country. The number may be from 1 to 4, and the higher the number, the harder it is for a power to remove or gain control of the country. For example, Bangladesh has a low stability rating of 1, while Paraguay shows an average stability of 2. And the Baltic republics have a high stability rating at 3. Some countries are orbit countries, and they show the flag of a power and 2 stability ratings. Their stability rating depends on the bloc that is performing an action related to the country. For instance, Ethiopia shows a red 1 stability rating, which applies to actions performed by their eastern bloc there, while the higher stability of 2 applies to actions performed there by the western bloc. And if a player controls an orbit country of an opposing bloc, that player earns an additional victory point over the victory point value of the country. There's 2 ways to win in this game: an automatic victory through objective cards, or winning by victory points at the end of turn 9. At the beginning of the game, each player receives 3 objective cards and keeps 2. And at the beginning of turn 5, each player receives an additional objective card. If a player fulfills the objectives of 2 of his cards in separate turns, the player wins the game. If this doesn't happen, at the end of turn 9, the player with the most victory points wins the game. The play of certain cards and certain actions in the game will earn or make a country lose prestige points. At the end of turns 2, 5, and 8, each player will apply the corresponding advantages or disadvantages according to their position on the prestige track. When performing a prestige check, the position of the media marker has to be determined first. Here the red block is in position 1. Russia and China receive a virtual position shift of 1 position towards the +5 space on the prestige track. Therefore, Russia and China receive the penalties of the next box, which is -4 for Russia and 0 VPs for China. And although this is not great for these 2 powers, it's an improvement over the victory point loss they would have otherwise received. And note that both markers will remain in their current position. Russia receives -4 victory points, and it goes from 21 down to 17. China, 0 victory point penalty. And the EU and the US receive a +1 op reserve marker. There's no leader effect because the EU and the US are tied for the lead. This is a card-driven game, and event cards are divided into 3 different decks, 1 for each decade. At the beginning of the game, only the first decade deck is used. At the beginning of each turn, each player draws 4 cards from this deck. And during each turn, each player will play 3 cards, and the remaining card in the player's hand is discarded to what is known as the leftover pile. All unique event cards, those are the ones with the trash can symbol, when they are played either for the event or for ops, are removed from the game permanently. All non-unique event cards, the ones without the trash can symbol, when they are played for the event or for the ops, go to the discard pile. Also, if a player exchanges cards with the leftover pile at the beginning of turns 3, 6, or 9, the exchanged card from the player's hand is placed in the discard pile. And between the decades, all cards from the discard pile are shuffled into the deck of the decade that is about to be played. At the end of turns 3, 6, and 9, each player counts their victory points based on all the regions and countries that they controlled at that time on the board. And if a player fulfilled an objective indicated in one of the objective cards at the end of any turn, the player has to decide whether to declare it during this phase and receive the reward indicated on the objective card. Let's take a look at an extended example of play that covers turn 1 and turn 4. Let's prepare the game board. The turn marker goes in the turn 1 space, the media marker in the 0 spot, and as to the victory points for each of the powers, all begin in the 20 victory point space. The prestige markers, Russia goes in the -2 spot, China -1, EU 0, and the US at number 2. Now we place access restriction markers. These are locks for the EU and China, and this limits their access to certain regions. For example, in Africa, China has to wait until the 2nd decade in order to be able to play an ops or an event card there. However, if turn 5 comes along, this restriction is immediately lifted. In Central America, we have locks for the EU for the 1st decade and for China, 2nd decade. In the Middle East, the EU has to wait until the 2nd decade and China, 3rd decade. And in South America, the EU has a 1st decade marker and China a 3rd decade marker. Southeast Asia, the EU has a 2nd decade marker, and in Asia, it has a 2nd decade marker. 4 cards are dealt to each of the players. Let's take a look at the cards dealt to each of the players, and we start with the EU player. Tiananmen Square Massacre. This is a Chinese crisis card. All effects are negative against China, and the card cannot be traded, discarded, or vetoed. The EU player has an EU event card, Ibero-American Summit. He can play it for the event or the ops. And he has another EU card, Schengen Area. And the 4th card is a negative Chinese event card, the Tibetan Conflict. Now let's take a look at the cards dealt to the US player. Atlanta 96 Olympic Games, a US event card. The US player can play it for the event or for the ops. Another US event card, Gulf Monarchies. And a US negative card that can only be played for the ops with the negative events listed there, Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And finally, a neutral negative event card, India-Pakistan nuclear escalation. Now let's take a look at the cards dealt to the Russian player, CIS, a Russian event card. The Russian player can play it for the event or for the ops. A neutral event card, Warlords, again, it can be played for the ops or for the event. And this is a war card, Algerian Civil War, which negatively impacts the EU if the war is triggered, and it can only be played for ops. And the effects of the card may or may not be triggered depending if the conditions on the card are met. And finally, Pope John Paul II visit to Cuba. This is an EU event card in possession of the Russians. Now let's take a look at the cards dealt to the Chinese player. The first one is a Chinese event card, 1997 Asian Financial Crisis. The Chinese player can play it for the event or for the ops. Suharto, this is a US event card. Balkan Wars, this is a war card that impacts positively the EU if played and the war is triggered. And finally, FARC, which is a Russian event card. Next, we go to initial deployment. And the order is China, EU, Russia, and the United States. And each of the powers has a choice as to initial deployment except for China. China always has the same initial deployment, a control marker in North Korea, and another one in Laos. The EU chooses option A and places a control marker in Poland, as well as Slovakia, and in Africa it places a control marker in Algeria. Russia chooses option A, places a control marker in Cuba, another one in the Caucasian republics, another control marker, this time in the Middle East and Syria, and finally one in Southeast Asia in Vietnam. And finally, the US chooses option B, placing a control marker in Panama, another one in Colombia, and finally a control marker in South Korea. Let's go through an extended example of play of turn 1. Before the action phase, in turn 1, the players of each alliance exchange a card, and this is denoted by the symbology that you see here in turn 1, but this happens in turn 1, 2, 4, 5, 7, and 8. And the EU player gives Ibero-American Summit to the American player. And the American player gives Gulf monarchies to the EU player. On the Eastern Bloc side, Russia gives CIS to China, and China gives 1997 Asian financial crisis to Russia. In this way, the 4 players have exchanged a card with their own event, with the idea that their ally will play the card and the ally will use the ops, while the player that gave the card away will benefit by the event. Note that the EU player would have liked to get rid of the Tiananmen Square massacre card, which does not provide him with any ops, but this is a crisis card, and crisis cards can never be exchanged. Now each of the players selects a card to be played and places the card in the negotiating center in the dotted line space face down. Now each player rotates their card so that it fits in the operations point or event box. So we have that 3 players have played cards for the event and 1 for the ops. Let's take a look at the cards. Event cards are always executed first, and among event cards, if there's any crisis card, the crisis card takes precedence. And we do have a crisis card, Tiananmen Square Massacre, which was played by the EU player. And this card cannot be vetoed or discarded to the leftover pile. So the EU player plays it, and this card has no ops value, only the event is executed. So China loses 2 prestige points and is down now to -3. Also, the media marker shifts 1 position towards the blue block, now in box 1. And China loses 2 victory points and is now down to 18. Now the players have to determine which event card is played next, the one played by the US or the one played by Russia. Both have an ops value of 2, so we proceed with the next tie-breaking criteria, which is victory points. And both the US and Russia are tied at 20, so we move on to the next criteria, which is prestige. And here, the US is ahead with +2 compared to Russia's -2. So the card played by the US player is now played for its event, and this is Atlanta 1996 Olympic Games. And as the event denotes, there is a shift of +1 in prestige for the US, and the US also receives a reserve media marker. So now prestige increases for the US to +3, and they place their media marker in their corresponding space. And whenever the EU places their media marker in their space, then the Western Bloc will be able to advance the media marker in their direction to the number 2 space. Russia played a neutral card, Warlords, for its event, and this gives them 4 ops to spend in Stability 1 countries in Africa. So they spend the first op to change Libya's status to Russian-controlled, and they do the same in Ethiopia. They spend the third op to bring Somalia into Russian control, and the fourth op to bring Congo. So if all these countries remain Under Russian control, when the global scoring phase comes about, the Russians will earn 6 victory points, 2 for each of the geostrategic countries, that is Libya and Congo, and 1 for each of the non-geostrategic countries, Somalia and Ethiopia. After resolving the events, it's now time to play the cards that were selected for their ops. Only one. China played Suharto, which is a U.S. event card. In these situations, the ops are played first. So China will spend 2 ops, and then the event will take place in favor of the United States. So the Chinese player decides to spend the 2 ops to take control of Pakistan, which is a geostrategic country with a stability of 2 in Asia. And now the U.S. event is resolved. Indonesia comes under U.S. control. So we place a U.S. control marker there, and a plus marker is placed on top of the U.S. box for the Southeast Asia region. Notice that this move doesn't favor China because it gives the United States control of the only geostrategic area in a region that is one of China's strongholds. And China could have vetoed the event, but China knows that it had traded the 1997 Asian financial crisis card to Russia, and Russia will most likely play this card. And when that happens, China can remove U.S. control from Indonesia. Once all 4 cards have been played, it's time to separate the cards that will be removed from the game permanently from those that will return to play when the second decade deck in turn 4 is added. Cards that show a trash can at the bottom center, which are the vast majority, will be removed from the game regardless of whether they were played for the ops or for the event. And in this case, we remove all cards except for warlords. And this step will be repeated at the end of each round. Now we move on to round number 2. Each player selects a card and places it in the dotted line space face down. And now all players simultaneously rotate the card either to the operation point box or the event box. And we see that 3 players played cards for the ops. Only 1 was played for the event. We flip the cards, and it's the EU player who played Schengen area for the event. And the event reads that the EU destabilizes 2 countries in Europe that are uncontrolled or controlled by an opposing bloc. And it cannot be a geostrategic country or an opponent's orbit country. So the EU player decides to destabilize in Europe Bulgaria and Romania. And what this means is that moving a position in these countries for the blue bloc will cost 1 op instead of the usual 2. 3 cards have been played for ops, so the card with the highest ops value is played first. And that's the card that the Russians played, 1997 Asian financial crisis. The Russians can play it for the 3 ops, and after that, then the events that pertain to China take place. So the Russians spend 2 ops to take control of Brazil, a key regional power in South America, and the remaining op is used to create an op reserve for use in a later round or turn before the change of the decade. And this is done by placing the corresponding marker in the space provided for it in the negotiating center. Now to the Chinese events. Victory points increase by 2, and China can choose one of the following countries to become uncontrolled: South Korea, Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, or Thailand. So China increases its victory points now to 20. And China decides to have the U.S. control marker be removed from Indonesia, and Indonesia is now uncontrolled. 2 cards left, and both were played for the ops, and both have the same ops value. So we determine the power that played the card that has the most victory points will go next, but all powers are tied at 20 victory points. So now we determine who has the higher prestige, and that is the United States. So the card played by the United States, which is Ibero-American Summit, an EU card, is played next. The US plays it for the ops, but the event will take place unless, of course, any of the other powers vetoes the event. And in this case, Russia doesn't want the event to take place. So they play their veto 2 ops marker to prevent it, and the marker is placed in the negotiating center as a reminder. So the event will not take place, but this has a cost for Russia in victory points. 2 victory points are deducted. Russia's down to 18, and now the US plays the 2 ops. Plays 1 op to take control of Iraq, a geostrategic country in the Middle East, and the other op to take control of Yemen. And note that each of these countries has a stability rating of 1. Finally, it's China's turn, and they played Balkan Wars. This is a war card. A war card takes effect if the country that is stated on the card is not controlled by the power associated with the card. In this case, the EU, and the Balkan republics is uncontrolled, so therefore it is not controlled by the EU. First, China plays the 2 ops from the card to advance up position on the prestige track, going from -3 to -2. And notice that each advance on the prestige track cost 2 ops as indicated on the track. And notice that China receives 2 ops to compensate China because a rival, in this case the EU, will receive a benefit from the event on the card. And now we go to the event. The Balkan republics come under EU control. So we place a EU marker in the Balkan republics, and they receive 2 victory points. And their score is now 22, but they also receive a negative shift on the media track for their block. So now the marker is placed in the 0 spot. And all cards are removed from the game except for Ibero-American Summit because it doesn't have the trash can symbol. Now we move on to the 3rd round. Each player selects a card, and all players played their cards for the ops. So the highest ops card will go first. That's the card played by the Russians. That is 2, the highest printed number on the card, plus the reserve, that is 3. So notice that this card will be used by the Russians for the ops, but they will not be able to use the 2 ops on the card because the effect has a negative impact on a rival. So they can only use 1 point from the card plus the additional ops reserve for 2 ops. And they're considering taking control of Kenya, and that would give them control of the Horn of Africa sub-region. In the alternative, they're considering playing the 2 ops in the Middle East, which is a region of high interest. And that's what they will do. They will conduct a coup d'etat in Iraq. And a coup d'etat is a 2-position move. That is, it moves from control of a rival to uncontrolled, and from there to control of the player that is taking the turn. So the first point is used to remove control of the United States, and the second one to place Russian control in Iraq. And by conducting a coup d'etat in a stability 1 country, Russia gains 1 victory point, so now they have 19. But the number of coups is limited per turn to 3, so now we reduce the available coups for Russia to 2. Now comes the negative event for the EU, causing it to lose control of Algeria and become destabilized. So we remove the EU marker from Algeria and we place a red destabilization marker there. Notice that there's another effect, and that is that a negative media reserve marker is placed on the media track for the Western Bloc. So we place the marker there in the space for the EU, and what this means is that the EU will have to later spend 1 op to remove this marker in order to continue cooperating with the United States on the media track. We continue with the 3rd round, and now the next card to be played is the one with the highest ops value, and that's the card that China played. CIS, a Russian event card. So China is playing it for the 2 ops, and China spends 1 op to change the status of Myanmar from uncontrolled to Chinese control. And you can see that Myanmar shows a 1 in a red background. That means that any country of the Eastern Bloc only has to spend 1 ops to perform 1 position change. 1 ops is spent by China to place a media reserve marker on the media track. And whenever Russia does the same, the media marker can be moved 1 space in the direction of the Eastern Bloc. And notice that a player can also spend 2 ops on his own to move the marker 1 space in the direction of his block. And now the event takes place. This is an event that favors Russia. And we have Belarus and Kazakhstan coming under Russian control. So we place a Russian control marker in Belarus, and we do the same in Kazakhstan. So the EU and the US each played a 1 ops card. Who goes next? Let's check who is leading in victory points, and it is the EU. The EU played the Tibetan conflict, a Chinese negative event card. And the card was played for the ops, but the event will take place unless it is vetoed. China doesn't want the media level to go down by 1 for the Eastern Bloc. So China plays its first veto for this turn. And the event will not take place, but China pays the price in terms of victory points. It now has 19. So now the EU plays the 1 op to place it in Romania, taking advantage that Romania is destabilized in favor of the Western powers. That means that instead of 2 ops to change a position, it only costs 1 op. So now Romania is under EU control. The US plays India-Pakistan nuclear escalation, a negative neutral card. In this type of card, there's no choice between an event and the ops, which is 1 in this case. It will always be played for the ops, and the event will be executed. So the United States plays the op, and it will use the op to prevent a coup in the Middle East, in Yemen. To do that, they place 1 stability marker in Yemen. And this way, removing the US from Yemen will cost the red bloc, that is Russia and China, 2 ops instead of 1 op. So now the negative event is executed. -1 victory point for the player that controls India. -1 victory point for the player that controls Pakistan. If either or both are uncontrolled, then we place a -1 victory point modifier marker instead. Pakistan is controlled by China, so China loses 1 victory point and is down to 18. India is uncontrolled, so we place a -1 victory point modifier marker there. All cards are now removed except the Tibetan conflict, which does not have the trash can symbol. We arrive at the end of the turn, and the 4 players discard their remaining card to the newly built leftover pile. There is no prestige check or global scoring phase in this first turn. So now we move on to the turn end phase, where control of subregions and objectives can be scored, but no subregions are controlled, nor have any objectives been achieved at this time. This concludes this extended example of turn 1. Now we move on to another extended example of play that shows play during turn 4. We start this turn 4 example with the exchange of cards between allied powers. The EU gives Ibero-American Summit to the US, and the US reciprocates by giving Exercise Malabar to the EU. And note that this exchange allows each of the powers to use the ops from a card that is originally owned by their ally, and this increases their strategic capabilities. On the Eastern Bloc side, China gives Beijing 2008 Olympic Games to Russia, intended to foster cooperation with its ally. However, Russia doesn't have a card of its own to reciprocate and gives China industrial relocation. This is an EU event card, and this is, of course, considered less advantageous. Ideally, Russia would have preferred to exchange the 9/11 crisis card, which does not provide any ops, but the rules prohibit the exchange of crisis cards. We go to round one. Each player selects a card, and 2 cards are played for the events and 2 for ops. Events go first, and among them, a crisis card. This is the card played by the EU player. This card does not generate any ops. So now we go to the events, and this affects the United States. It will be -3 in prestige, -2 to its victory points, and Saudi Arabia will be destabilized. So U.S. prestige goes from +2 to -1, and its victory points are reduced to 22. Saudi Arabia is destabilized, and this is a permanent event that has effects during the rest of the game, so we place a marker for the event in the permanent event section of the board. China played Investment Surge in Africa. Chinese event card for the event. Could have played the card for ops, but it chose to play it for the event. The first effect that we see on the left-hand margin is that Africa is unlocked to China. So China now has access to Africa. We remove the Chinese lock from Africa. The other effect is that China chooses 2 of the following countries to come under their control: Nigeria, Angola, or Ethiopia. Note that China already is dominating in Asia as well as Southeast Asia. So they're looking for another region to dominate. So they choose in Africa Nigeria, which is a geostrategic country with a worth of 2 victory points. And now they have to choose between Angola and Ethiopia. And they choose Angola over Ethiopia, for the reason that it is more challenging for the Russians to take control of Angola than Ethiopia, because Ethiopia has a stability of 1 versus the Russians. The cards for the event have been played. Now we play the cards for the ops. The highest value op card is the one that Russia played. ASEAN +3, that is a Chinese event card. With an ops value of 3, the Russians played for the ops, and then we resolve the event. So the Russians spend 2 of the 3 ops to improve their position on the prestige track from -3 to -2. And the remaining op is spent to place a reserve op marker in the negotiating center. And now the event takes place, and China chooses a country in Southeast Asia to come under their control. It cannot be an opponent's orbit country. Also, Japan and South Korea are destabilized if they're uncontrolled or controlled by an opposing bloc. Let's start with the second part of the event. We see here that Japan is controlled by the United States, so now it's destabilized. South Korea is uncontrolled, so it is also destabilized. And now China has to choose a country in Southeast Asia to come under their control, and they choose Cambodia, and they do that because they still have in their hand the U.S. military bases event card, which when played will unleash the event that will have a change of position towards the U.S. in Malaysia and Thailand. So China would lose control of those countries. So that's why China chose instead Cambodia. The U.S. plays Ibero-American Summit. This is an EU card, so they're playing it for the ops. And this is to shift Panama from uncontrolled to U.S. controlled, and asserting their dominance in Central America. Now the event takes place, and there's a +1 position move for the EU in a 1 or 2 stability country that is uncontrolled in Central or South America. It can't be a geostrategic country or an orbit country. So the EU chooses Haiti, and the EU is taking aim at the Caribbean subregion in order to score points there. Because the card has the open padlock as to South America, we remove the padlock for the EU there. Now the EU can set their sights on uncontrolled countries in South America. Having completed the round, now the sorting of cards occurs. Those cards that are marked with a trash can symbol at the bottom of the card are removed. And the only card left is Ibero-American Summit, and this card will be reintroduced into the deck when the third decade deck is added in turn 7, and this procedure is repeated at the end of each turn. It's round 2, each player plays a card, and cards are all played for ops. So the highest ops card will be played next. We see 2 cards with a value of 2, the cards played by the Russians and the card played by the EU, but the Russians will play first because they have a reserve ops marker. So the total ops for the order purpose is 3. So the Russians will play warlords for the ops, and they use the 2 ops to conduct a coup in Iraq. And a coup is a 2-position move from US control to uncontrolled to Russian control, and each move costs a number of stability points indicated there. So the first op removes US control, and the second op places the Russian control marker there. So it's been an effective coup in Iraq, and there's a bonus in victory points for successful coups, and this one is in a stability 1 country, so Russia gains 1 victory point, and now they have 25. And we mark the available coups per turn for Russia, and they have 2 remaining. The EU played Exercise Malabar, a US event card for the ops, and this card has an event that gives the US 2 ops in certain countries in the Far East, and China doesn't want that event to be triggered, so now it plays its 2 ops veto marker. And this has a cost in victory points. China loses 2 victory points. It is down to 19. And now the EU plays the 2 ops. The first op is used to place a destabilization marker in Libya, and this will make easier for the Western powers to change the position of Libya in the future. And the second op is used to purchase a reserve ops marker, which is placed on the board. Both the US and China played a 1 ops card, but because the US has more victory points than China, the card it played now takes effect. This is a neutral negative event card. The US plays it for ops, and it has 1 op, so the US will place a reserve media marker on the media track. And now to the event, Nigeria becomes uncontrolled, and if already uncontrolled, it is destabilized against the bloc playing the card. Nigeria is under control of China, and China cannot veto this event because it already played its 1 veto per turn for this turn. So the Chinese control marker is removed and Nigeria becomes uncontrolled. China plays the Beslan Massacre, a Russian negative event card for the op point. And Russia doesn't want to lose a prestige point if the event goes through, so the Russian player plays his veto 1 op marker and pays the cost, that is 1 victory point. And now the Chinese player uses the op to purchase a media reserve marker and places it on the media track. And we end the round by removing permanently from the game the 2 cards that have the trash can symbol. To the third round, each player plays a card. Only 1 card played for the event. It's the card played by the US, Afghanistan, and Iraq wars. And this card has a condition. It can only be played after the September 11 attacks event, and that has already happened. And we have here the reminder marker placed on the permanent events display. And Afghanistan is under Chinese control, and Iraq under Russian control. So this war will take place. In addition, the US will gain 2 victory points, but the Western Bloc will lose 1 media point. So the US takes control of Afghanistan and Iraq, and the US gains 2 victory points. It has now 24. The Western Bloc loses a media point. The marker is now at pro-Western Bloc 1. Notice that had these countries been under US control, then this war would have not taken place, and the card would be playable for the greater ops value of 2. The three cards that are left were played for the ops, so the highest ops value card is played next. That's the card that China played, U.S. military bases. This gives China 3 ops, and China will use those 3 ops to make a position change in South Korea. Notice that South Korea has a destabilization marker. That means that stability for the Eastern Bloc is 1 less than the printed value of 4. It is 3, so the 3 ops go to change the position there from uncontrolled to Chinese control. We remove the destabilization marker, and China will earn 1 additional victory point in future global scoring by controlling an orbit country of the opposing bloc. And China will also, if things stand as they are, gain 4 victory points on account of control of the Korean Peninsula subregion, since they control North and South Korea. So now the U.S. event takes place. It's a +1 position change for the U.S. in Malaysia and Thailand. Both of these countries are uncontrolled, so they now come under U.S. control. And there's a 1 position change for the U.S. in Haiti or Honduras. Haiti is controlled by the EU. That would bring Haiti to uncontrolled status. So the United States chooses Honduras, which is uncontrolled and is now under U.S. control. The next card to be played will be that played by Russia, because it's a 2 ops card plus the reserve op. That's 3. The EU card that was played is a value 1 plus the reserve op is 2. So the card that Russia played is European Migration Crisis, an EU event card, a negative event card. Russia will only be able to use 1 op from the card because the card provides a negative effect to another player. And notice that Russia didn't play this card they have in their hand that they can use for 2 ops, Beijing 2008 Olympic Games. So this card is played for the single op, which Russia will use to remove U.S. control from Iraq. And that results in a 5 victory point tie in the Middle East. The negative event reduces media for the Western Bloc by 1, and the EU's victory points also by 1. So the media marker is now in the 0 spot, and the EU now has 24 victory points. The EU played Uyghur Conflict, a China negative event card for the op. And now the EU player declares that he will be playing the op reserve marker. So he has 2 ops, and with that he declares a coup d'etat in Libya. Libya has a stability of 1 versus the Western Bloc because of the blue destabilization marker there. So with the first op, Russian control is removed. It becomes uncontrolled, and with the second op, Libya now turns to EU control, and we remove the destabilization marker. And because the EU has taken control of a stability 1 orbit country, the EU now gains 2 victory points and has 26. And having concluded this round, now we remove the cards that were played that have the trash can symbol. Each player now places the remaining card in their hand in the unplayed pile. We've reached the end of turn 4. There is no prestige check like at the end of turn 5, nor any global scoring like at the end of turn 6. So we proceed to check if any of the powers has control of a sub-region, and this is done at the end of every turn. China has taken control of the Korean Peninsula sub-region, so China will be gaining 4 victory points, and we flip the tile for that sub-region face down. This can only be claimed once per game. So China now has 24 victory points. No objectives have been fulfilled. So now we remove the veto markers that were played, and note that Russia keeps its op reserve marker for play in any of the remaining turns of the decade, that is turns 5 or 6. And this is where this preview video ends. This is New Cold War, a game designed by Andoni Orive and Igor Plaza and published by Vuca Simulations. And as you can see here, this is a 4-player game, but it can be played solo or with less than 4 players. And I hope that this video has given you a good idea of the flow of the game and what the game has to offer. This is Stuka Joe, signing off for now. Thanks for watching.